They told me, plain as a text on a Tuesday night, that I wasn't welcome at Christmas. I had been standing in my kitchen that evening, one hand on the back of the worn leather chair where Maria used to sit, the other on a mug that still smelled faintly of her cinnamon tea. The house was quiet in the way a place is quiet when it has outlived the person you built it with. Lights at half, the tree in the window giving off a soft, private glow. The message from my son said, "Dad, we don't expect you for Christmas this year. It's better this way." No explanation, no call. Just that sentence and a photo of their dining room set dressed up like something from a magazine. White candles, gold placemats, laughter frozen in pixels. Before I get into the rest, if you're watching this, please stick around until the end. If this speaks to you, subscribe for more stories like this and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It helps to know we're not alone. I had been a raiser of roofs and a fixer of broken things my whole life. I learned to do things with my hands, and then somehow I learned to turn those hands into a small business that paid for this house and the insurance on it. When Maria was sick, I sold overtime and took odd jobs to pay for treatments. When she died, I buried her with my own two hands on a day that smelled of cold dirt and borrowed faith. After that, I worked. I sent my boy to college, not because I wanted accolades, but because I thought of the debt of love as something you kept paying until it wasn't owed anymore. For 5 years, I had been paying parts of Michael's life. Not in some theatrical, all-or-nothing grand gesture, but in small, steady installments that added up. Monthly transfers to cover a mortgage hiccup, checks for school fees for their twins, money to get the car fixed after a winter slip. I signed up for autopay when Michael started his own landscaping business, and his wife, Isabella, wanted to redecorate the house for their first proper holiday. I told myself it was family. I told myself Maria would have wanted it. I told myself whatever it took to get through the nights. I didn't know the total until I had to know it. The discovery happened the way most reckonings do, boring, domestic, and slow. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Maria had taught me how to judge the doneness of a roast by the sound it made, and I opened my bank statements because the house insurer had hiked the premium, and I wanted to see where the extra would come from. If you'd asked me then whether I expected to find 5 years of payments labeled with my son's name, I would have told you no. I would have been lying. The first thing that told me something was wrong was the phrasing on the transfers. Rent assistance, family loan, emergency, birthday. There were small sums at first, 300, 500, but here and there were sums that made the numbers start to look like a second job. $1,200, then $2,000. They came out like clockwork on the 2nd or 3rd of every month. A tiny blister on my account that I had paid without thinking. Over time, they stacked. I made a running tally on a legal pad like a man taking inventory of a shed he had inherited and found the tools missing. I had kept every canceled check since Maria's funeral. It was an old habit, the kind that comes from being poor once and learning to never lose track. I started matching the transfers. Match by match, month by month, the scars of my generosity became visible. Late mortgage notices I had paid for, utility bills I had covered, a pricey surprise patio I had wired, the receipts for the twins' braces that I had thought were the product of an insurance claim. 5 years. Not a single conversation in which Michael said, "Hey, Dad, I'm in trouble." Nothing. I hadn't been asked for help so much as kept on a slow drip. Anger came like a winter draft, sharp, immediate, and a thing that made the body try to find the heat of reasoning. I remember sitting on the edge of the leather couch and rubbing my face until I could see only the veins of the hand in front of me. I thought about Maria and how she would have handled a betrayal like this. She would have made soup and named everything she was feeling so we could look at it together. I had no Maria, only bank statements and a phone that would not ring. I did something small and decisive that night. I called the bank and asked to speak to someone about stopping automatic transfers. The clerk's voice was patient, like a river smoothing a stone. "We can put a stop on that," she said. Is it a temporary hold or permanent? I thought, for a second, of leaving it as a minor threat, a tap on the shoulder. Then I thought of Maria's ring, the way it caught light on the table when she laughed. I wanted my money back into my life, not poured into someone else's domestic theater. Permanent, I said. That single word felt like dropping a stone into still water. The ripples would reach farther than I could see. The next morning, I lit the fireplace. Not because I wanted to burn money. That would have been stupid and symbolic in equal measure, but because I needed to watch something turn. I took a stack of photocopies, bank statements, the screenshots of transfers I had printed, the email confirmations that said transfer completed. I had no plan to harm anyone. I had a need to mark the end of a pattern. Fire felt like an honest way to mark it. For 20 minutes, I watched paper curl and surrender to ash. I kept a jar of the ashes on the mantel for 2 weeks, an obscene talisman of a man who finally admitted he had been used. They didn't respond immediately. There were weeks of awkward silences, Christmas cards that did not arrive, holiday texts that were left unreplied to. Michael called once, and we spoke about the weather. There was a careful avoidance of the numbers. It made me wise to how fragile relationships can be when they rest on an invisible bank account and the presumption that one person's labor will indefinitely underwrite another's life. Then the retaliation began in a way I didn't expect. Patricia Morrison, a local columnist with a voice like syrup and the appetite for a good grief-fueled scandal, ran a short piece calling me a father who had retreated after an anonymous tip. Social snippets were brusque. Estranged father finds Christmas is where he left it. The story implied that I was cold, that I had chosen absence over family. My phone lit up with messages from neighbors, some asking if I was okay, others with the thin sympathy of people who prefer to watch the fall rather than help the climb back. Isabella's family, Cody and Catherine Jenkins, started to send passive-aggressive texts to the group chat about boundaries and toxic enabling. Their messages, posted with the kind of performative righteousness people use when they want to win friends at a dinner party, sounded hollow and prepared. Cody had always been good at making everything look effortless. He had a way of smiling like the world was a set he could direct. The public side of their life had always mattered more than what was true behind the curtains. I could have responded with a public statement. I could have matched their smears with my own. But I had learned that shouting never fixed the thing that needed fixing. The problem, I reckoned, was not their words, but the truth they had been trying to hide. It wasn't about proving I was a good father. It was about proving that I had been used and that I refused to be the bank of last resort for people who called charity family as if it were their right. So I did what felt most like me. I prepared. I made copies of every relevant document, organized them into little envelopes, and labeled each envelope by year and by purpose. 2017, mortgage assistance. 2018, car repairs. 2019, business loan. I wrote the totals on the inside of the flap because numbers, for all their dryness, are a kind of language I had always trusted. On the night I decided to stop being invisible, I took those envelopes and I planned a place to put them where they would not be dismissed as the mutterings of an old man. I vowed to put them where they would be seen. The idea for the dinner reveal came to me as I sat with Rosa. Rosa had been Maria's sister, and since Maria died, she had become the kind of friend who knew when to say little and when to offer an extra slice of pie. She had a small apartment 2 blocks away, a kitchen that smelled of garlic and old laughter. She had been there the first Christmas after Maria was gone. The salt on her face telling me that grief is a path walked in company, not a place you escape. When I told her what had happened, how they had told me I wasn't expected, how my bank told me I had been subsidizing a life that wasn't mine, she listened and then signed my name with an index finger. "You do what you think you must, Dennis," she said, But do it with your head. Don't make a show of rage. Make a show of truth. That line, make a show of truth, stayed with me. The truth was heavy. I'd been carrying it in my pockets like spare change. It deserved to be counted. I called Michael and asked him to meet for coffee. I did not try to disguise my intention. I wanted to see him face to face, to look for the look that says a person is genuinely unaware, and that says a person is complicit. He agreed. We met at the diner on Main, the booth still sticky with other people's lunch. He came in with the kind of swagger people learn when they believe they have the moral high ground of being better off than they were. He greeted me with a hug that had the quality of habit. We sat. For a while we talked about neutral things, the weather, the progress of his business, the twins' school play. Then I slid a photocopy of my bank statement across the table. "Is this yours?" I asked. He looked at it and then at me. There was a small widening of his eyes, an almost pelican-like gulp. "Dad, You've been getting money every month from me for 5 years," I said. My voice was not loud. It did not have to be. "You never told me. Not when your truck died, not when you didn't make payroll, not when Isabella's father offered to lend you money and they wanted me to cover the rest." Michael's face went slack. He looked suddenly like a boy tricked by his own appetite. "I thought you knew," he said. "I thought we talked about it." "You didn't tell me," I said. "You let me think what I needed to think. You let me be the stoic widower whose son was on his feet." The words felt mild in my mouth, but sharp in his. He started and stopped with apologies. Then the conversation collapsed into the usual defenses and rationalizations we'd all used our whole lives. "We needed help," he said. "Isabella's father had lost his job for a month and it was complicated." Complicated in these conversations often meant convenient. That night after I left the diner, Michael texted to say he was sorry and that he'd call. He called the next day and tried to shift the blame. Miscommunication, shame, pride. He asked me not to make things worse. When I told him I had already stopped the transfers, he went quiet until there was a careful, brittle voice on the other end saying, "Please, Dad, reconsider. The kids." The kids. That had been the lever used for 5 years. They were the gravity that kept me orbiting that relationship. Pictures of the twins, short videos of birthday candles blown out. A steady supply of grandfather content to justify financial fatigue. I could feel Maria in the empty spaces of our conversation, and the way that love was used as a currency felt like sacrilege. I prepared the envelopes, and I prepared myself. My hands trembled a little when I placed them into a larger folder, but the tremble was part of being alive, not a fear. Fear would have paralyzed me years ago. Now it was practice. The dinner was at their house. They had invited people from their circle, friends from the school play committee, neighbors whose lawns were always too tidy, Cody's cousin who worked in real estate and liked to attribute his success to networking. For a while, I thought about not going. There is dignity in absence, in not allowing those who would make you small to stage your humiliation. But there is also dignity in showing up with your truth and letting others decide what they will do with it. I wanted them to see that I was neither a ghost nor an ATM. I wanted to sit with what I had lost and what I had finally chosen to reclaim. I wore a suit I had not worn in years, a simple navy with a threadbare lining, polished shoes that still had the smell of the repair shop. I poured a small measure of whiskey before I left, the kind Maria liked when she allowed herself a little indulgence on winter evenings, and it tasted to me like resolve, warm, bitter, and honest. When I arrived, the house smelled of roasted onions and pine. The Jenkinses had strung extra lights across their mantel, and Isabella had placed a centerpiece that looked like a small, contemptuous crown. People were laughing in measured ways, the laugh of those who are not worried and so can afford to be indulgent. Michael saw me at the door, and his face went green, then contrite, then hastily polite. "Hey, Dad," he said. "You made it," I said back. The table was a long, gleaming thing. I sat, and they passed plates with the sort of choreography that tells you how well practiced a household's grief avoidance is. For a while, the evening was what every holiday dinner in suburbia is, an elaborate performance of comfort. There were toasts, someone joked about the school's fundraiser, someone else asked if I was still keeping up with my business. I answered in small, neutral sentences. At some point, while the plates of roast were still being passed, and someone was talking about a Pilates class that had changed their posture, I stood. The room quieted, because public silence is always invested in curiosity. I placed the folder on the table, slid it open like a book you mean to keep open. I told them, in a voice I had rehearsed silently for weeks, what the envelopes were. "These are copies of every transfer I made to this household over the past 5 years," I said. "They're labeled, they're dated, they show what was paid for and what was never discussed." The air changed. Laughter died like a candle with wind. Isabella's chin went hard. Cody's smile thinned. Patricia, who had been the friend of a friend at the far end of the table, put down her fork like something she had been given as a relic. I did not fling the documents across the table. I did not shout. I let the truth sit there like cold silverware, available for anyone to pick up and examine. People did. They shuffled the envelopes. Someone read aloud. 2018, Emergency Fund for Isabella's father's business, $3,500. Heads turned. Eyes met mine and then looked away. Isabella began to speak, a script of outrage and bewilderment. "He never told you," she said to Michael and to me. "You know how hard we have worked to keep this family together, Dennis." Her voice had the tightness of someone who believes in a narrative about themselves that cannot be punctured. Those were loans. They were always meant to be paid back. I wanted to ask who they were supposed to be paid back to, since the payments had been filed under gift on several of the slips they had given me to sign. I wanted to tell her about the nights I went to bed with the hollow feeling of a man whose contributions had become an invisible expectation. Instead, I said simply, "You never asked when I could help, only told me you could not get by without it." Cody tried the strategy of deflection. "Dennis," he said with the smoothness of someone used to selling things to a room, "this reads like a misunderstanding. Everyone makes mistakes with money." He named accountants and taxes and blamed the complexity. He suggested mediation with the smile of a man who thought of mediation as a chance to keep secrets in a neutral room. Michael looked like a man about to drown, and realizing the current that would take him under had once been his own doing. He stood, voice small and raw. "Dad, I didn't want to put you in this position. We didn't think you'd notice. I'm sorry. He reached for me, and I let him take my hand. For the first time in months, he wasn't trying to smooth or sail. He was just a son who had to look at the harm he had complicitly caused. The dinner table became a tribunal of neighbors and friends. Some asked questions like a small-town council. When did this start? What will you do now? Others watched in a way that made me think about how public humiliation has become a spectator sport. Patricia, the journalist, scribbled briefly in her notebook. I later learned she had been traded between camps in the small-town rumor mill. I laid out the totals, amounts by year, the steady accumulation, the months where their business had reported income but the house showed bank transfers. I did not gloat when Catherine read the numbers aloud and then excused herself to stand in the yard where she sobbed into a napkin. Even their shame, I thought, deserved privacy. My goal was not to annihilate them, but to stop being their endless resource. The evening left a taste in my mouth that was both sharp and strangely clean. People drifted away with murmured promises to talk privately, to make things right. I understood then what I had really been doing all those years, buying an illusion of family continuity at the cost of my own stability. I had been paying for someone else's performance of security. What followed in the week after the dinner was angry and bureaucratic and, in a way, inevitable. When I stopped the transfers, the Jenkinses missed mortgage payments that had only been barely kept current by my money. Their lawn company, one that Cody had been counting on to be his safety net, found itself without the expected payroll. The local bank called them. There were late notices. People who had accepted their hospitality with the same ease they accepted a show ran out of excuses. I did not set out to ruin anyone. I would not say I took joy in their faltering. But I had started a thing, and things have consequences. Then the county mail arrived at my door one afternoon on a flurry of wind and brown envelopes. There was a notice that a lien had been placed in relation to a business loan the Jenkinses had used as collateral. It was the kind of official paper that never says, "We're sorry," only, "This is your legal reality now." Watching them receive their own copies of the same notice a week later felt like watching a stage set slowly fall apart. They called me furious because if their payment stopped, the dominoes that had been hidden behind their wallpaper began to fall. A foreclosure notice arrived at their house 10 days after that, a cruel letter that made the world of tidy lawns and perfect centerpieces look grotesquely fragile. There were consequences in the court of public opinion as well. Patricia's initial column that had sided with the family and questioned my motives was replaced by a more measured piece after she had seen the documents and heard from the bank. She wrote about complexity and the cost of silence. It wasn't a redemption story. It was a local newspaper doing what it could within its small authority, naming facts. Some people apologized in notes that read like people trying to undo a social error. Others stayed silent, the accomplices who prefer the deep end. Michael came to me one evening when the house was cold and the twins were with their mother at her sister's. He sat at my kitchen table and put his face in his hands. "Dad," he said, I wasn't thinking about what I was doing to you." "You weren't that's what you were doing to me," I corrected. "You let me think what I needed to think." He told me about the pressure he'd felt from Isabella to keep up appearances, how he'd lied about payments he couldn't make. He didn't make excuses. He made a request to come back to repair the distance. He wanted forgiveness and a return to the rhythm of the boy who used to sleep under my roof after a storm. I could have let the money buy my way back into being the warm center of their lives. I could have resumed transfers and signaled that the old pattern was intact. But I had learned something about dignity that winter in the quiet of the house. Dignity, once surrendered, is not something you can reclaim by handing out dollars. It is reclaimed by setting boundaries and living by them. So I made my terms. They were not theatrical. They were practical and small. No more transfers, but I would help with an emergency fund that required receipts and joint oversight. Michael would attend counseling with me present so we could talk honestly. I would see the twins twice a month and spend time with them, no conditions about my money allowed. The terms were met not with immediate gratitude, but with the slow acceptance of people who had to measure their loss and their pride. There was a reckoning for them beyond my boundaries. Cody lost a client, and without the cushion of my transfers, the payroll he had been covering with borrowed money evaporated. Catherine's social circle, so loving when it was being properly catered to, narrowed. They did not become villains in a novel. They became people who had to face what happens when safety nets are made of someone else's life savings. Michael came back, as he'd promised, not the same as before, but with a weight lifted by confession and the clumsy grace of someone trying to live honestly. He brought the twins for the first time in months and sat across from me at my table, his posture different, his eyes less practiced. He brought a small drawing the twins had made of me, stick figures that had my crooked grin, and I kept it on the fridge for months because small things tend to be more true than great gestures. Rosa was right about one thing. Doing it with your head matters. It keeps you from being a spectacle. But doing it with your heart matters too. I had been angry and I had been hurt. I had also learned how to be brave in small ways, to refuse to be invisible, to refuse to be an ATM labeled family. The house felt different after I set the terms. I stopped sleeping with the radio on because it had become a sound of urgent distraction. I started cooking proper meals again instead of rationing stale crackers for dinner. I drank my whiskey in the evening and did not pour the remainder down the drain. The jar of ash from the fireplace went into the compost one spring morning. It was a private ritual, not the end of the world. There were awkward neighborhood moments. People would meet me on the sidewalk and give me looks that tried to weigh me in the balance of sensible or vindictive. Some neighbors invited me for potlucks, wary, as if to test whether I had been transformed into a cautionary tale. Aunt Rosa invited me to her table the Sunday after Christmas and served me chicken that tasted of thyme and absolution. She did not ask for my papers or demand retribution. She just sat with me while the twins, across the way, chased each other with comic disregard for adult consequence. Years later, when the scars had faded to stories and the story had settled into a new rhythm, Michael and I learned how to be a family with new limits. He paid what he could on a schedule that did not make him frantic and did not make me complicit. He learned to ask for help with dignity rather than hiding need and balancing it on the back of my decency. Isabella and Cody left town after a string of bad investments and a refusal to adjust their lifestyle. Whether they found peace or simply new places to perform their tastes is a story I would not tell from assumption. The part I held closest was not the money. It was the way I learned to say no and mean it. The way I learned that being generous did not require being used. The truth I had made public was not a trophy. It was a boundary that let me sleep. On a small July evening, Michael came by with the twins and a pie he had not bought at a store. He said a few awkward sentences about pride and lessons, then sat down. We ate pie on my porch under a light that Maria would have said looked like a street vendor's string. We talked about small things, a neighbor's geraniums, the way the twins would now try to build something out of scrap wood a little like their grandfather. He asked if he could borrow my drill. I laughed and handed it over. He promised me, as he had promised before in less honest times, that he would try to be better. But this time there was no promise of money attached, only the promise of presence. That was enough. I learned to accept that kindness does not mean endless tolerance of being taken for granted. I learned that family can be reconfigured by the choices we make about respect and responsibility. I learned that my dignity was worth more than the empty glory of being the benefactor in a play I did not cast. Most nights now, I sit by the window with a book I never finish and a small glass of whiskey. Sometimes I look at that tree in the window across the street, the one that used to be their holiday backdrop, and I think of light and the way it can change a room's mood. I am not expecting anyone for Christmas this year, and if the doorbell rings, I will open it because some doors are worth opening and because Isabel's twins still like the cookies I make when they visit. But I will not let my life be the stage upon which others perform a life that I have not agreed to finance. If this story reminded you of something, maybe a long kindness that was taken for granted, or a time you had to draw a line, tell me where you're listening from and what you did. If you want to hear more stories like this, please hit subscribe, like the video, and share this with someone who needs to know they're not alone. Thank you for staying with me through this. After I thanked them on the video and closed the tab, the house did not immediately become holy ground. It was still a place where socks went missing in the dryer and where the sink occasionally betrayed me with a stubborn clog at the worst possible hour. But the air felt different, the way a room feels after you open a window. Not less full, just newly ventilated. Spring taught me patience the way grief had taught me grief. Slowly, in lessons you cannot rush. I began to keep a small list in the back of an old church program. The plants I wanted to coax out of the hard clay in the yard. the books I meant to finish, the things I would do when I stopped pretending I had time. It was ridiculous and honest to write "learn to prune the rose bush" next to call the dentist, as if the virtues of horticulture and molar health were equal measures of adulthood. They felt equal to me. Michael's visits settled into a pattern. He came on work nights when the traffic was tolerable and brought pies he had not purchased from a chain. He brought apologies that smelled faintly of the same humility he showed toward his children. Practical, unadorned, and not always easy to believe. Sometimes he stopped by with a small useful thing, a new light bulb that screwed in without requiem, a folded raincoat for Cody when work left him cold, and sometimes he did not. When he faltered, when the old neat excuses crept back through a shy grin, I held to the calculus I had made. Presents without payment could still be counted. Presents with manipulation would not. The twins grew along their own crooked lines. They learned to sand wood so it did not bite. They learned that hammers required more attention than shouting. I found myself sitting on the porch with them, teaching them to thread a screw without taking it as a conquest. They asked how many screws it took to hold a house together. I answered, more than you would think, fewer than you fear. Their hands began to look practiced. They began to bring me small things, shavings of pine, a carved heart the size of a coin, and leave them on my windowsill as if setting trophies out for someone to find. Aunt Rosa came around more often than I expected. She was a woman for whom consolations came in the form of lemon curd and blunt truths. One evening she arrived with a casserole and an opinion about my tendency to speak of boundaries as if they were decorative, like new curtains. Boundaries, she said, lifting her chin to the sagging kitchen clock, are the scaffolding you keep up while you build the house you mean to live in. Don't let anyone make you live under someone else's scaffolding. That's one metaphor I won't argue with, I told her. She smiled and said, you still do, you know. You still watch the tree across the street like it's a weather vane. She was right. Some nights, light was not simply light, but the weather of other people's feelings. I had started to notice how light could change a face, how the curve of a child's smile looked different in lamplight than under the noon sun. I learned to take those differences at face value and not to read prophecies into them. Work, steady, smaller, more dependable than the dramas I had grown used to, kept me honest. I had a schedule that began with a pot of coffee and the careful clearing of my desk. I sometimes imagined that the desk was a shoreline, and I was always checking the waterline for debris. On particularly tired afternoons, I would find solace in the small rituals, folding the corners of handouts, straightening pens in a cup as if aligning the world would align me. My friendships deepened in the ordinary places, over borrowed sugar, in the muttered confessions exchanged while pushing a cart through the grocery aisle. A neighbor named Liza, who worked nights answering frantic emails for a company I barely understood, taught me to make a good omelet. We compared our misadventures with fitted sheets and laughed in the small language of those who have watched the same silly things happen to them for years. Once, in the middle of a particularly wet November, I received a call from Isabella. She had been moving again, this time an apartment on the other side of town, and there was a box she could not quite lift. Her voice was a thread pulled through a tape measure, thin, vulnerable, rehearsed. For a moment, the old reflex, open wallet, steady hand, hummed awake. I felt the familiar ache like a pressure under the ribs. Then I remembered the count I had made. A lifetime of favors does not entitle a person to forget how to carry their own burdens. I can come by in the morning, I said instead. I'll bring the dolly. We'll make an afternoon of it. She was embarrassed and grateful in the same breath, and the conversation reminded me that mercy is not the same as rescue. Mercy can be a hand at the shoulder. I'll help you lift this, yes, but you must learn how to balance it yourself. We hoisted the box together, and I watched her discover that she could make a small decision that did not end in disaster. Christmas came and went with a quiet that suited me. I did not go to war with loneliness. I set places for no one and for people I might one day expect, a ritual rehearsal. Michael stopped by with the twins and an apology carved into a careful speech about responsibility. We ate cookies that the twins had insisted on bringing, and Michael borrowed my drill and returned it clean. He did not give me money. He gave me presents and the odd, halting promise to be better. Being better, I had found, was a long-term project not always reflected in a single night of good intentions. As the years lengthened like the shadow of the elm in the yard, my life assumed a set of smaller, truer pleasures. I took a class at the community college on book conservation because I liked the idea of learning how to save things. It seemed appropriate, an extension of the work I had done on myself. Among the students, there were people who loved to handle pages in a way that looked like prayer. One of them, a woman named June with a laugh like a bell, taught me how to rebind a torn spine. We spent an afternoon with glue and clamps, coaxing a damaged book back into something readable, and I felt the same satisfaction I felt when I drew a line and did not allow it to be crossed. There were small victories I hesitated to call triumphs. A neighbor helped me get a leaking skylight fixed and refused payment, a day that reminded me that not all help was a debt. I learned to accept favors greedily and gratefully when they were offered without expectation. I also learned to decline the ones offered as currency. The difference, so small in language and so vast in consequence, was who was left with the choice. Once, not long after I had begun to sleep without the radio, I invited Maria over for coffee. She had a habit of arranging candles on her windowsill in a way that made the street look calmer than it was. She had been my confidant in years where confidence was scarce. We sat at my table and spoke of nothing weighty. The conversation wandered to the tree across the street and how the city lights had changed the way people hung their expectations. "We put lights where we think warmth should be," she said, "and sometimes they just make the night more complicated." "Then why do we keep doing it?" I asked. "Because light looks like hope," she said, "and hope is hard to stop." It was not the only sort of light I had been measuring. There was a different, quieter kind, the light of choice, of deciding where to lend your days. It was less showy than a string of bulbs, but steadier. It did not ask for praise. In the summer that followed, the twins had a school project, a birdhouse they had insisted must be painted the same bright red as their grandfather's truck. They asked if I would help. I bought a tiny brush and a can of paint, despite the voice that worried about money. The paint was cheap, and the joy in their faces was not. We stained the wood, and the smell of it, sharp and industrious, filled the porch. They handed me a screw and looked at me as if I were a harbor. When they finally stood back and admired their work, they did not notice how small the birdhouse was in relation to the world. They only saw what they had made. There were moments of temptation, of course. Letters arrived from Isabella. Sometimes they were thinly veiled pleas. Cody called once, his voice tight with pride and shame. "Can you wire me a little something?" he asked. Money, help, mercy wrapped in the old costume. "I can listen," I said. "I can help you find a way. I can't fix this for you." He argued in the old familiar way about loyalty and family and the honor of never asking. I listened and then closed the door on the old pattern as gently as possible. It did not feel like a victory then. It felt like the dull, steady work of staying true to a promise I had made to myself. New rituals grew up around the edges of my life. I started a small Saturday ritual of going to the market for vegetables I did not yet have the courage to cook. I bought too many herbs and learned the names of them in the careful way of someone learning a second language. Parsley, thyme, rosemary, each a word that tasted like possibility. I learned to make soups that would keep for 2 days and not taste of compromise by the third. One spring afternoon, a man moved into the house next door. He appeared with a cat in a cardboard carrier and an armful of boxes that did not always match what the labels implied. He introduced himself as Sam and said, with the modesty of someone who had learned to make fewer grand plans, that he liked to fix things. He had been a machinist, he said, and now he worked part-time at the repair shop across town. Repair, I repeated, which is to say, do you mean everything? Mostly cups and chairs, he said, smiling, but I'll try anything once. This was the sort of neighbor who leaves a ladder in your driveway and then denies all knowledge, but who also brings over a jar of his wife's jam when you are sick. He knocked on my door one rainy morning with a thermos and a tray of biscuits. Thought you might like to come over, he said, as if offering a small treaty. We're putting up a shelf and could use an extra pair of hands. I thought of declining. I thought of the porch and the book I'd not yet finished. I thought of the way my shoulders had grown used to being their own scaffolding. Instead, I took my coat and went. We spent the morning measuring, leveling, and swearing at screws that refused to bite. The shelf stood up at the end like an honest sentence. Sam talked about his mother teaching him to mend socks with a fine thread, and the way a house starts to look like a home after you let it collect other people's warm things. His cat, named Gimlet, sat on the windowsill and judged our progress with the cool interest of someone who knew nothing of our obligations. When I returned home, it was a small thing to notice that the house felt less like a hermitage and more like a place where things occurred. Repairs, visitors, the occasional disorder. It was not chaos, it was life. Sometimes, late at night, I would think of the ledger of favors that had defined my earlier years, what I had given and what I had been paid in thanks. And I entertained a thought that might have seemed revolutionary to my younger self. Perhaps the measure of a life is not the tally of what you have distributed, but the steadiness of the line you draw around yourself. I liked the idea of a life with margins, a place where something could happen without robbing me of the rest of myself. There were other moments, small and bracing, when I would glimpse the person I had been before the labor of being the household bank, the woman who used to read late into the night and who kept a ridiculous collection of foreign postage stamps in a tin. Once, cleaning out a drawer, I found a letter I had written to myself when I was 25, full of promises and a wild, earnest optimism that scarce resembled the cautious person now folding laundry in the kitchen. The letter sounded foreign and dear. I kept it folded until the nap of the cat settled over it like a benediction. One evening, as autumn took on the scent of stale leaves and wood smoke, Michael arrived with more than apologies. He came with a box he had carried himself, and with the small, careful look I had seen before, the one men have when they are trying to show that they have learned something without asking to be forgiven for everything. He did not speak of money. He spoke of shame and of trying to live smaller. Smaller meaning enough rather than extravagant displays. I can't give you back the evenings you gave me when I should have been doing my own work, he said, but I can try not to take what you offer as a place to land. It was not a dramatic admission. It was rather a weather report. I accepted it. We ate pie on the porch. The twins fell asleep on the couch at some point and dragged their blanket behind them like small sailcloths. The porch light, which Maria had once said looked like a street vendor's string, hummed and draped the evening in a soft, forgiving glow. After they left, I sat on the steps for a long while and thought of the way the house had changed me. I thought of all the small things I had learned: to say no and mean it, to accept help without feeling ashamed, to hold a space that was mine and not another stage. I thought of the way my life had been reconfigured by choices both quiet and loud. There were no parades for these changes. Instead, there were mornings where I woke and decided what to make for breakfast and for whom. There were afternoons when I learned to prune a rose with an efficacy that felt like prayer. There were evenings when the sound of a child's laugh could unspool into something that felt like a benediction rather than a claim. The future, as always, remained unpinned. I did not expect miracles. I expected small continuities. Neighbors who could be counted on, books that could be mended, pies that could be baked without fuss. I expected the occasional rupture and the particular skill of responding without fury. On a Tuesday in November, Sam knocked at my door holding a flyer and a hopeful look. "There's a community repair night at the shop," he said. "People bring broken things and we fix them together. Thought you might like it." I looked at the flyer and at his earnest face and felt the old reflex, that tug toward saying yes even when the cost was my vigil. But I saw, too, the small arithmetic of a life I had been building. Repair nights meant company, the steady hum of tools, something to learn and to teach. It meant I could be useful in ways that did not require me to pay the bill of someone's life. "Tomorrow?" I asked. "Tomorrow," he said, and his smile made the porch light seem, briefly, like the kind of warmth that was not a performance, but a shared resource. I folded the flyer into my pocket and thought of the shelf we'd put up, of the birdhouse the twins had painted, of Aunt Rosa's casserole, of Maria's candles. I thought of the woman at 25 with her ridiculous stamp tan, and the woman I had become by degrees through the daily work of setting boundaries and keeping promises to myself. When I went to bed that night, the house was full of the comfortable clutter of living, a cup on the counter, a pair of boots by the door, a small carved heart on the windowsill. I turned off the light and listened to the hum of the street, feeling like someone who had learned how to keep the light burning because she had finally learned how to choose where it should go. There were more things to be learned, of course. There always would be. But for the first time in a long time, I felt as if I was learning them from a place of rest rather than exhaustion. The next afternoon, I carried the flyer in my pocket like a talisman and walked across the yard to Sam's house. He was already loading tools into the back of his truck, Gimlet following like a shadow. The twins were there too, squabbling amicably about whose turn it would be to hand up the next screwdriver. "Ready?" Sam asked. I nodded. The small work of mending seemed finally less like a chore and more like a covenant. We drove to the shop together, a place that smelled of oil and reason, and when I stepped inside, the room felt like an altar to possibility. People were there with chairs, with lamps, with radios that had stopped singing. They spoke to one another the way people speak when they know how to exchange favors without tallying a ledger. I felt for a moment like I had come home to a kind of republic, imperfect, noisy, and mutually sustaining. I set down my bag, rolled up my sleeves, and reached for a tool. The small life I had built, the boundaries, the quiet refusals, the carefully guarded kindnesses, was a thing I carried into the room as naturally as a hand carries a cup. It did not have to be announced. It only had to be practiced. And so I practiced. The drill I had lent to Michael once became a tool passed between hands with small blessings and instructions. The twins learned how to countersink a hole without splitting the wood. Sam taught a man how to retube an old lamp. June, from book conservation, showed a woman how to trim a frayed book edge. We mended things, and with them, in small ways, we became less prone to breaking. Outside, the sky was the color of unburnished metal, promising no grand epiphanies. Inside, the room hummed with the ordinary work of repair. I found in the steady turn of a screwdriver a quiet contentment I had not expected to find again. When the evening wound down, someone suggested we go out for coffee. I declined, for I had practice in holding to plans, and instead walked home in the dark that was no longer frightening but simply necessary. The porch light blinked me in like a lighthouse. At my kitchen table, I sat with a cup of tea and a pair of gloves that needed darning. The work was humble. It was, in the end, my work. I had traded the stage for the workshop and, in doing so, given myself a steadier audience. People who arrived with things to fix and left with things mended. It was not glamorous. It was not meant to be. It was close enough. I lay the gloves on the table and smiled at the small, stubborn knowledge that some things never quite stop needing care. That realization no longer made me despair. It made me plan. It made me set down the list I had started years before and add a new line. Go to repair night again. There would be more nights, more pies, more words that would need saying and then saying again in different tones. There would be relapses, there would be reconciliations, and there would be afternoons when the twins brought over a stick they had whittled into a new animal and presented it like a peace offering. There would be empty chair and full chair and all the ordinary rearrangements that make a life whole. I closed my notebook and left the light on a little longer, as if illuminating the room might teach it gentleness. Outside, someone in the house across the street turned on their string lights. They shimmered in the same familiar way, hopeful, complicated, and permissible. I put my hands together over the cup and felt, finally, that the boundaries I had set were not walls, but frames. They let the world in on my terms. They let me choose when to open the door. There was no ceremony to this knowledge. There was only the slow accumulation of small days. And tomorrow, if the twins asked me to show them how to use a plane, I would say yes. I would make them promise to keep one hand on the wood at all times, and then I would teach them the patience of shaping something that must be held steady to become useful. They would listen, half mocking, half rapt. I would watch them learn. I would keep my hand near theirs until I trusted that they had steadied. I liked that future, modest, attentive, full of ordinary repairs. I liked that it belonged to me as much as to anyone else. I liked that I could, at last, keep a light on without feeling as if I was the only thing burning in the room.